It started with a sound not loud, not sudden, just wrong. One morning in early October, I stepped out to grab the paper from my driveway and heard a soft groan behind the ridge. Not a branch cracking or a squirrel leaping through the dry leaves. It was the earth itself settling, shifting, whispering its discontent. Years in the Army taught me to recognize tension before it explodes, but it wasn't my military instincts that prickled my skin this time. It was something older, deeper, something born of the land. My name is Ray Lambert. I'm 57 retired U.S. Army engineer, single father of 2 grown boys, and the longest-standing resident of this cul-de-sac in Highland Ridge Estates. I moved here 18 years ago after losing my wife to cancer. Back then, the HOA was just a formality, a few retirees who passed out newsletters and reminded folks to keep their grass trimmed. That changed 5 years ago when Karen Bolton took over the board presidency. Everything became political. Everything became a rule. But this story isn't about her yet. It's about the ground. The hill behind our homes wasn't just a slope. It was an old glacial runoff packed with clay, loosely held together by generations of tree roots. For people like me who read land like a language, this hillside had been talking for months. The poplars at the crest leaned a little more every year. Fence posts bowed inward. Drainage lines sagged unnaturally. I'd noticed it all. I even took note sketches, cross-checked old civil engineering documents I still had from my base days. Then came the crack, a literal one. Behind my backyard, right near the rusted utility access, where the HOA had long refused to pay for maintenance, a hairline fracture emerged in the soil, small yes, but unnatural. I used a plumb bob and a slope gauge just to be sure. The incline had shifted 1.7 degrees in just 30 days. That's not erosion. That's warning. I called my son Caleb, he's a geology grad student out in Flagstaff, and sent him pictures. His exact words, "Dad, that's a classic creep pattern. You got hydrostatic pressure building. One good storm and that thing's going to lurch." Still, I didn't panic. I did what a reasonable man does, documented everything. I walked the ridge that Sunday, took fresh photos of the slope line, the buckling near Karen's patio edge, the subtle yawning of the walking trail that curved through HOA land. I wrote a 5-page report and emailed it to the board with a subject line that couldn't be ignored. Urgent safety concern. Potential landslide risk. That was Monday. By Wednesday, no one replied. On Friday, I got a note taped to my mailbox. It wasn't from Karen directly. She never got her hands dirty, but it had her tone all over it. "Dear Mr. Lambert, your recent communications have been reviewed. The HOA board sees no imminent danger and advises against causing undue alarm in the community. Please refrain from unauthorized surveying." Unauthorized surveying. They said it like I'd broken a law. I laughed at first. Then I felt that old familiar pressure in my chest, the kind I got when orders from above meant walking men into a situation they didn't fully understand. I'd seen this kind of arrogance before, the kind that came wrapped in laminated bylaws and brittle egos, and I knew what always came next. Still, I tried one more time. I approached the next open HOA meeting. I sat through 30 minutes of lawn care, disputes, and parking policy proposals before Karen finally let me speak. I showed my photos, my measurements, even cited a 2009 city geological survey that rated this hill as low to moderate stability contingent on vegetation retention. They stared at me like I was reading from a science fiction novel. Karen folded her hands and smiled like a substitute teacher tolerating a student's wild story. "Ray, we appreciate your passion, but we've had no slides here in 30 years. And our landscaping project has already been approved by the committee. We're removing those trees for aesthetics and visibility." My voice trembled not with fear, but frustration. "You cut those trees and this slope will come down. Maybe not tomorrow. Maybe not next week. But the rains are coming, and this soil won't hold." She just blinked, then chuckled. "If we start panicking every time dirt moves, we might as well evacuate the whole town." The room laughed. And just like that, I became the doomsday guy. After the meeting, one neighbor clapped me on the shoulder and whispered, "You okay, Ray? You sounded kinda intense." I nodded and smiled. I'd seen worse in Fallujah than HOA smugness. But still, something in me twisted. Over the next few days, I kept watching the ridge. I set up a motion trail camera pointed at the fracture line. Each night, it shifted a millimeter here, a leaf displaced there. I logged it all. Then one morning I noticed a new line. Not behind my house this time. This one was behind Karen's. It curled like a lazy smile through the landscaping stones she'd imported from Italy. The same stones she had ordered 2 months ago when she began her elevated patio redesign. I took one picture. Then I made a copy of everything I'd gathered so far and placed it in a sealed folder in my desk drawer, because I had a feeling the day was coming when someone would ask, "Did anyone see this coming?" And I was going to say, yes, I did. And I'd have proof. The Monday after the HOA meeting, I received a certified letter from the board. Not email, not a phone call. A formal envelope with the HOA seal embossed in cheap gold foil. It read, and this letter serves as a formal reminder that unsolicited surveys or geological assessments are not permitted on HOA-governed common areas without board approval. Repeated violations may result in fines or further action under Section 6B of the Community Guidelines. There it was, a veiled threat. I wasn't surprised, but it still made my jaw tighten. I'd spent the better part of my career learning how to speak clearly under pressure field operations, chain of command disputes, even congressional budget briefings during my time in Logistics Command. But there's a specific kind of bureaucratic arrogance that corrodes logic like acid. Karen Bolton had mastered it. Karen didn't run the HOA board. She was the board. She'd arrived like a social hurricane 2 years after her husband, a venture capitalist, retired early and poured his money into a quiet life in Highland Ridge Estates. Their house sat 3 lots up the slope from mine, a glass and stone monstrosity that jutted into the sky like a knife planted on a ridge that had no business holding that much weight. She smiled a lot, but it never reached her eyes. After I received the letter, I called the city geotechnical office. I asked if there had been any recent soil stability inspections on our side of the hill. The woman on the line, Monica, politely informed me that the HOA had declined the city's optional survey package the year before. They wanted to save money. She said, "Save money." Then she paused. "Wait, are you saying you're seeing displacement?" "Yes," I told her. "Cracking soil creep, slope migration. And they just cleared a patch of trees." Her voice shifted. "If that slope goes, it could take out at least 4 lots. You should escalate this." "I've tried," I said. "They're not interested." She took down my contact information and promised to flag the area in the city's hazard report queue. But she warned me unless it's considered an emergency or results in an incident, we can't override the HOA's jurisdiction without an inspection request from the board or a homeowner consensus. There it was again. The gatekeeping wall HOA boards build one that insulates them from liability while exposing the rest of us to risk. I wasn't done. That same evening, I walked the ridge again. Not on their land, just along the public utility easement that snaked up behind my property. I took new photos carefully time-stamped of the additional buckling near Karen's foundation. She had just installed those granite pavers. Now they rippled like soft clay. I printed a set of pictures and slid them into the HOA's Dropbox, along with another letter, less formal this time, more urgent in tone. I wrote, "You are proceeding with construction in a zone that is exhibiting signs of active land shift. Any damage or injury resulting from your negligence will be documented. I strongly recommend halting further work until a certified geotechnical review can be conducted." 2 days later, my mailbox was vandalized. Smashed clean off the post. No note, no witnesses. I didn't report it. I just bolted it back up with fresh screws and made a mental tally escalation had begun. It wasn't just Karen either. People started pulling away from me. Susan, who used to wave every Thursday when I brought in my bins, looked the other way now. Dan, the guy across the street who borrowed my post hole digger 3 times and never returned it, suddenly developed a case of "didn't see you there, Ray." The board had painted me as a troublemaker, a liability, worse, a liar. But it wasn't until I saw the next HOA newsletter that I truly understood the depth of their denial. Printed on glossy cardstock and mailed to all 87 homes, the October issue included a section called Community Clarifications. In it, Karen had written the following. Despite recent rumors circulating about so-called land instability, Highland Ridge Estates remains structurally secure. Residents are reminded to avoid speculation and unauthorized assessments. We trust our approved engineering partners and will not tolerate fear-mongering. Fear-mongering. I felt the heat rise in my chest as I read it under my porch light. They'd twisted my concern, my evidence-backed, professionally informed warnings into a neighborhood punchline. The next day, a group of landscaping contractors arrived near Karen's lot. I watched them unload massive pallets of imported stone wheelbarrows full of poured concrete and load-bearing steel frames for what looked like an extended terrace. They were expanding, right on the lip of an unstable ridge. I walked over not confrontationally, just calmly. I spoke to the foreman, a wiry man with sunburned arms and dusty boots. "You have permits for this build?" I asked. He squinted at me. "I got a work order signed by the HOA. Talk to them." I did. I attended the next HOA meeting again, sitting alone in the back this time. When I raised my hand, Karen skipped me. When I stood up anyway, she spoke sharply. "Mr. Lambert, the board has already addressed your concerns. This is not an open forum for repetitive complaints." "It's not a complaint," I said evenly. "It's a warning." "Then consider yourself warned," she snapped. "Any further disruptions and we will involve legal counsel." The room was silent. I sat back down. I didn't speak again that evening. But in my mind, I started cataloging. Not just soil movement, not just construction, but faces, words, silences. Because when the ground falls out, it doesn't discriminate. It doesn't care about titles or newsletters or HOA meeting minutes. And when it did, I was going to remember exactly who ignored the warning. It was a Tuesday morning in mid-November when the humming started. Not from nature, but from machinery. I had just sat down on my back deck with a cup of coffee and my worn leather notebook when the low growl of diesel engines shattered the quiet. Through the tree line that bordered Karen's property, above mine, I saw the bright yellow flash of excavators and the jerky motion of chainsaws hacking into wood. Men in reflective vests were hauling brush, tearing down every bit of green that clung to the slope. Oaks, redbuds, and mountain laurels gone branch by branch, root by root. They were cutting the trees, the very ones I had begged them to leave alone. I set down my mug and walked up the ridge. Not quickly, not with shouting, just a steady, silent climb like I'd done on 100 reconnaissance walks through dangerous territory. But unlike those war zones, this wasn't an enemy I could see on radar. It was buried alive, waiting under soil. Karen stood near the contractor's clipboard in hand, sunglasses perched on her head like a crown. She was wearing white sneakers, pristine and totally impractical for the rocky dirt she stood on. "Morning, Ray," she said with a tone like honey over broken glass. "What are you doing?" I asked, though I already knew. "Cleaning up. We've had too much shade up here." Not to mention, she gestured to the stumps already stripped bare roots messing with our patio plan. I looked past her to the slope. A dozen root systems, some as thick as a man's thigh, had already been ripped out, exposing raw clay and splintered cavities. These weren't just trees, they were anchors. They were the only thing holding that fragile hillside in place. "Karen," I said carefully, "these trees are the last defense against a landslide. You're exposing the slope to erosion and undermining your own foundation." She gave a small laugh. "We consulted an arborist. They said the trees weren't aesthetic to the landscape design." I stared at her blinking. "An arborist, not a geotechnical engineer." "They're plants," Ray, she replied with a patronizing smile. "Not mountains." No amount of logic could cut through the smugness of someone who had power, but none of the training to wield it. I turned to leave, shaking my head when she called after me. "Oh, and by the way," she added, flipping a page on her clipboard, "you'll be happy to know the HOA board voted to install a French drain system. So water will be properly diverted from our yard going forward." I stopped. "Diverted to where?" She looked confused for a moment, then waved it off. Downhill, obviously. Downhill. Straight toward my home. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in my den, every light off, except the dim glow of my desk lamp poring over old civil maps of our neighborhood. The HOA's new drainage trench, which I now realized they were already digging without permits, would direct all surface water runoff into the dry swale behind my house. A swale that until now had been manageable. But if the rain came, and it would, that swale would become a chute. A loaded gun aimed at the base of an already compromised slope. I tried to warn others. I walked door to door with copies of my diagrams, circled the trouble zones in red, explained the soil layers, the hydrology, the fracture lines. Most homeowners nodded politely, took the papers, and promised to read up on it. But I knew the look. It was the same one I'd seen in soldiers staring down orders they didn't want to understand. The look of avoidance. Then one neighbor said it plainly. "Ray, even if you're right, what do you want us to do?" "Confront Karen. She'll bury us in code violations." There it was. The reason tyrants win not through strength, but through exhaustion. She wore people down with memos and citations until no one had the will left to speak. I had one last idea. The city. I called Monica at the municipal building again. I asked whether HOA activity that alters stormwater flow, particularly without a permit, could trigger enforcement. There was a pause. "Technically, yes," she said. "But they'd have to be caught in the act, or you'd need a formal civil engineering report. And unfortunately, our inspections team is backlogged until January." That was 6 weeks away. We didn't have 6 weeks. Because that very night, the forecast came in an early atmospheric river moving in from the Pacific predicted to dump over 7 inches of rain on the region in 3 days. I knew then this wasn't just a warning, this was the countdown. The next morning, I took my trail cam off the tree where I'd mounted it 2 months ago and checked the footage. There it was, a slow progression, time-lapse stills showing subtle shifts in the hillside. A retaining wall near Karen's home had dipped by nearly 3 inches. You could see it clear as daylight. I printed the images, marked them, assembled the packet. Then I did something I hadn't wanted to do. I drove to the county office and filed a formal report against my own HOA. The clerk at the counter raised an eyebrow when she read the description. "Do you have legal counsel?" she asked. "Not yet," I replied. She handed me the carbon copy and said, "If this escalates, and it will get one." When I got home that evening, there was a message on my answering machine. A man's voice, low and controlled. "You're making a mistake, Ray. You're putting yourself in the middle of something bigger than you understand. Back off. Now." Then a click. No name, no number. No fear either, because if they were calling anonymously, they were worried. And they should have been. Because I just lit a match under everything they were trying to bury. The day after I filed the report with the county, I got a call from Monica. Her voice was different this time. Clipped, urgent. "Ray, I flagged your packet. My supervisor reviewed it. We can't send out an inspection crew yet, but he wants you to submit a sworn affidavit. If the situation turns dangerous, your documentation could trigger emergency jurisdiction." I nodded silently, gripping the receiver tighter. "I'll do it." That night, I spread everything I had across the dining table. A mosaic of warning no one wanted to see. Satellite images, time-lapse photos, my trail cam shots, hand-drawn diagrams of slope curvature, a printed map of Highland Ridge estates with red zones marked for known slip points. The crack behind Karen's home was now visibly longer in every frame. But even with all of it laid bare, I felt that gnawing pit of doubt crawl up my spine. Not doubt in the data, doubt in the system. Would anyone act before something collapsed? I forced myself back to focus, remembering why I was doing this, not just for my home, but for everyone living beneath that ridge who didn't know what was coming. By midnight, I'd written and signed my affidavit under penalty of perjury. In it, I described slope integrity caused by the removal of root systems, the added weight from new patio structures and imported materials, the unlawful rechanneling of water from HOA-controlled drains into unreinforced ground, the visible fractures soil, slump, and creep measurements I'd collected over 90 days. I faxed it to the county office, emailed copies to Monica and her supervisor, and printed 2 more to store in my gun safe. Then I made a video, just in case. It was just me sitting at my desk, time-stamped with my digital watch in frame. I spoke directly to the camera. "If you're watching this," I began, "then something has happened." I laid out everything in plain language. I didn't want this to be about engineering language or degrees of slope. I wanted it to be about human choices, about arrogance, about people who ignored facts because aesthetics looked better than truth. I didn't mention Karen by name, not yet, but I made it clear the HOA had been warned, repeatedly, with evidence. By the end of the video, my voice was shaking, not because I was scared, because I was angry. The kind of anger that lives in the space between knowledge and inaction, between watching a train barrel down the tracks and having no power to switch the rails. The next morning it rained. Not a drizzle, not a spring patter. It poured. Buckets of water slammed into the earth as dark clouds rolled over the ridge like invading forces. Within an hour, the swale behind my property overflowed. Water gushed over the retaining stones, pushing mud toward my foundation. I moved quickly, sandbags, trenching emergency pumps. Muscle memory from flood response deployments kicked in. My house would hold. But I looked uphill and I knew theirs wouldn't. By the second day of rain, the slope behind Karen's house had turned to soup. I took another photo, a hairline crack that had split into three, widening like the veins of a leaf under pressure. That evening, I received an email from the HOA board. It wasn't a letter, it was a summons. Subject: notice of violation, HOA code SARU 8A3. They accused me of conducting unpermitted alterations to common drainage, citing the emergency ditch I dug behind my yard to redirect overflow. My emergency pump, the one that had kept my crawl space from turning into an indoor lake, had been labeled unauthorized hydro modification equipment. I read it twice and then laughed. It wasn't even anger this time, just pure surreal disbelief. They weren't just ignoring the danger, they were going after me for surviving it. I replied with a single sentence: any enforcement action taken against me will be included in the city's active negligence investigation file, ID number 2286HR. I hit send. 30 minutes later, my phone rang. Karen. She'd never called me before. Her voice was too sweet, like someone trying to melt a blade into butter. Ray, we don't have to make this so adversarial. I mean, we're neighbors. Funny, I said I thought we were threats. She sighed. You've always been a little dramatic. Karen, your backyard is sliding. Please, she said, lowering her voice, don't blow this up. We'll fix the drainage issue after the storm. The board just doesn't want to be embarrassed. Embarrassed. That's what it was all about to them. Not lives, not homes, just reputation. I hung up. The next morning, I woke up at 3:42 a.m. to the sound of metal shearing. It wasn't thunder. It wasn't wind. It was collapse. I grabbed my flashlight and rushed outside in the pouring dark. Mud was streaming down the slope fast and thick. The air reeked of torn earth. I ran to the back fence, squinting up toward the ridge. And there, in the brief flicker of lightning, I saw it. Karen's patio had split in two. Half of it was gone. Swallowed. Her entire eastern retaining wall had crumbled, taking with it a section of her home. Not the whole structure, not yet, but enough that her roof now pitched at a grotesque angle. I watched as lights in nearby homes flicked on, people screaming, dogs barking, floodlights snapping awake. The rain was still coming. Emergency sirens rose in the distance. I took one step back from the fence, and I whispered aloud, not in triumph, not even with satisfaction, but in bitter, exhausted affirmation. They didn't listen. But now they would have to. The morning after the partial collapse, Highland Ridge Estates was unrecognizable. What had once been a pristine neighborhood of manicured lawns and luxury facades now looked like a disaster zone. Emergency cones lined the upper road. Police cruisers and fire rescue vehicles crowded every inch of the cul-de-sac. Yellow caution tape zigzagged across driveways like a warning scrawl from nature itself. But none of it could compare to what I saw standing in front of Karen's home. Her $1 million palace, once the HOA's showpiece, had become a surreal monument to denial. The eastern side of her house, the one she had renovated just months before, hung at an impossible angle. The glass walls she had proudly installed were now fractured spiderwebs, the once imposing stone columns tilted inward like drunken soldiers. One of the patio support beams had sheared off completely, its twisted rebar sticking out like a snapped tendon. I stood across the street, arms folded, soaked to the bone in a raincoat, watching as two engineers from the city conducted a perimeter check. Karen wasn't outside yet, but her SUV, previously the envy of every board member, sat parked haphazardly on the slanted driveway, its front wheels partially buried in runoff silt. Then I saw her. She emerged from the front door, wrapped in a luxury bathrobe, hair matted and eyes wild, like a queen freshly dethroned by a coup she never saw coming. She looked straight at me. For a moment, neither of us moved. The wind whipped between us, carrying the distant wail of a siren still echoing from down the hill. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Just the empty gasp of someone watching their constructed reality turn to mud. I broke the silence. "You need to evacuate Karen," I called over. "That whole slope's unstable. You've got undercutting all the way to the main beam." Her expression cracked, not just the panic of property loss, but something deeper. The realization that I had been right, that she had gambled with gravity and lost. Instead of replying, she turned away, stepping back inside like a ghost retreating into a burning building. Later that afternoon, the city posted a red tag notice on her door. Structurally unsafe. Do not occupy. It was only then that I learned just how deep the irony ran. Her grand renovation, the marble tiling, the elevated hot tub, the double-layered terrace had been approved not through proper permitting channels, but under an obscure HOA bylaw that allowed aesthetic modifications up to a certain square footage without city notification. Karen had used that loophole, pushed it as far as she could. She'd expanded beyond the regulated limit by claiming the additions were non-structural beautifications. In truth, they had added thousands of pounds of pressure to an already unstable slope. And when the earth gave way, it didn't just take stone and steel with it. It took her reputation. By evening, news vans were parked at the edge of the development. Cameras scanned the shattered hillside. Microphones caught soaked residents describing the terrifying rumble, and whole side of the hill moving like soup. One reporter approached me as I was helping a neighbor reposition his sump pump. "Sir, I heard you tried to warn the HOA. Is that true?" I looked straight into the lens. Yes. I filed a formal report, presented evidence, and was dismissed. "Do you believe this collapse was preventable?" I took a breath. Absolutely. That clip aired on the 6 o'clock news. The next day, my inbox was flooded, some with apologies, others with quiet admissions of guilt. But the one that stood out came from Monica at the city. "The footage and documentation you submitted will be included in the emergency hearing. Multiple homes are now under structural review. The county attorney's office may be opening an investigation into HOA negligence. You should prepare for a subpoena." I printed the email and added it to my folder. Meanwhile, the HOA board scrambled like ants after their hill was kicked. Emergency meetings were called. Damage control memos were sent out, spinning the collapse as an unexpected geological event. Karen released a statement through her lawyer claiming she had followed all proper procedures and approvals. But residents weren't buying it. By the end of the week, more homeowners began inspecting their foundations, noticing cracks where none had been before. One family 2 doors down had to evacuate entirely after their back patio sank by 6 inches overnight. People began knocking on my door, not to accuse, to ask for help. I sat with them, showed them how to check for telltale signs of ground shift, shared copies of my earlier diagrams, advised on which city offices to contact. In 2 days, I helped 7 families submit formal repair claims to their insurance claims they wouldn't have thought to file, without proof the HOA had been warned. Karen, meanwhile, went silent. Her once daily emails to the neighborhood ceased. The HOA newsletter skipped its monthly release, and whispers began about how she had bullied vendors into signing work waivers, about how her cousin, an unlicensed contractor, had poured the initial concrete slabs, about the missing minutes from the meeting where her renovation was approved. One neighbor, a former CPA named Linda, approached me on Saturday. She held a manila folder, hands trembling. I pulled the HOA's expense records for the last fiscal year, she said, eyes darting around. There are invoices for land improvement, signed off by Karen, but no matching deposits, thousands unaccounted for. And get this, some of the receipts are duplicates with different totals. It hit me then this wasn't just incompetence. It was corruption. And the hill didn't just collapse under rain. It collapsed under lies. By the time the second storm system rolled in, the rumors had already metastasized into something more sinister. The rain I could prepare for, I had sandbags ready, trench drains cleared, every emergency measure rehearsed like a drill from my deployment days. But the quiet threats, they were a different kind of flood. 3 days after Karen's red tagging, I found a note taped to the back of my pickup. Just a folded piece of printer paper, damp from dew, with 5 words scrawled in thick Sharpie. "And you ruined everything. Stop talking." No signature, no finger pointing. But I didn't need a name. The handwriting matched the passive-aggressive flyers HOA used for parking violations. It stank of desperation, the kind you only see when control slips through polished fingers. I didn't report it. I logged it. Instead, I poured myself into gathering more evidence. The city had opened an inquiry into potential negligence by the HOA board, and Monica had confirmed I'd be asked to testify at the preliminary hearing. But that alone wouldn't be enough. I knew how these things went. Without a tight case, people like Karen could wriggle free citing unforeseeable natural disasters or engineering ambiguities. So I gave them none. I compiled a timeline backing every point with physical proof, date-stamped photos, soil survey overlays, emails to and from the HOA board receipts for emergency work audio recordings of meetings where warnings were ignored. Every decision, every silence, every dismissive smirk from Karen etched itself into the narrative like fresh fault lines. But even as the truth stacked in my favor, I felt something else creep in. Fear. Not mine, theirs. The HOA board wasn't just defensive. They were scared now. You could see it in the way Alan, the HOA secretary, started avoiding eye contact at the grocery store. In how Marcy, who once loved to swing by unannounced for neighborhood gossip, now crossed the street when she saw me walking the dog. And then came the meeting. An emergency session hastily organized and poorly attended due to rain and whispers. I hadn't planned to go, but Linda, the CPA neighbor, convinced me. They're trying to change the bylaws, she warned, quietly. In the middle of this chaos, I sat in the back of the rec center, arms crossed, as Karen's stand-in, a nervous board member named Trish, called the meeting to order. Karen, according to the agenda, was on leave for personal reasons. Trish's hands shook as she read out loud a proposal to amend Section 4C of the Community Charter. The change would shield HOA board members from personal liability in cases of natural degradation of land unrelated to gross negligence. Linda leaned over and whispered, "They're trying to retroactively protect themselves." I stood. Not loudly, not dramatically. I just stood and said, "Is this about the collapse?" Trish froze. "Mr. Lambert, this is a closed board matter. This affects every homeowner here," I said. "And the fact that you're doing it in the middle of a storm with half the neighborhood absent tells me you know it's wrong." Murmurs broke out. Someone to my left clapped once, then another. I didn't press further. I didn't need to. They tabled the vote. And from that moment on, the silence began to break. Neighbors who once avoided me started talking. One man, James, who lived above the runoff line, admitted the HOA had paid him to store heavy building materials near the ridge temporarily last fall. Another resident forwarded me a screenshot of an HOA group chat where Karen mocked my warnings, calling me Mr. Mudslide and joking that I'd probably call FEMA over a puddle. It stopped being my battle. It became ours. But Karen wasn't done. 1 week later, I received a cease and desist letter from her lawyer. It accused me of defamation interference with contractual relationships and reputational harm. It demanded that I retract all public statements made about her and the HOA, or face a civil suit. I read it in my kitchen, while the rain hammered the windows steady and unrelenting. Then I turned the page over, grabbed a pen, and wrote in block letters, "See you in court." I mailed my response, certified. Because here's the thing. No one tells you about standing up to people like Karen. They're not prepared for someone who's already faced real danger. I've dodged shrapnel, watched friends bleed out in sand, and held a crumbling bridge together with nothing but wire and grit. I wasn't scared of a lawsuit. I was scared of what would happen if no one ever challenged people like her. And nature didn't wait for permission. That night, the second landslide hit. Smaller than the first, but more damaging in a way. This one took out part of the HOA-maintained walking trail, undermined the edge of Lot 43, and dislodged a drain pipe that emptied directly behind Marcy's garden. Mud poured through her retaining wall, pushing through the fence like thick coffee sludge. Marcy, who had once mocked my warnings, stood on her back deck, phone in hand, tears streaming down her face as her lawn dissolved into slurry. I crossed through the rain to check on her. She didn't speak. She just looked at me with eyes full of guilt and fear and whispered, "I'm sorry." I nodded. She didn't need to apologize to me, just to the land. Because it never stopped speaking. People just stopped listening. It was 2:14 a.m. when I heard it again, the sound I'd dreaded for months. Not thunder. Not wind. It was deeper, heavier. A low grinding groan like the earth clearing its throat before screaming. My eyes snapped open, heart pounding. I didn't waste time pulling on shoes or a coat. I grabbed the flashlight, the go bag I always kept by the door, and rushed into the night. Rain slammed into my face like needles. The flashlight beam jittered in my trembling hand, slicing through the storm toward the ridge. The sound was louder now, like a freight train in slow motion, earth collapsing in great chunks, not all at once, but like a giant exhaling piece by piece. Then I saw it. The topsoil behind Karen's house, what was left of it, was slipping. Not mud this time. Not runoff. It was structure. Her home, her masterpiece, was coming down. The eastern wing had already vanished, swallowed by the hill. The pool she'd built for ambiance now poured water down the slope in a silver ribbon of chaos. The custom pergola twisted like matchsticks, its beams flailing into the air before disappearing into black earth. And then I heard the scream. Karen. She was still inside. Jesus Christ, I muttered, vaulting over my back fence and sprinting uphill, feet skidding in mud. I could barely hear my own breath over the wind and the gut-deep rumble of the land shifting beneath me. I didn't think, I didn't plan. I just moved. By the time I reached the house, the front steps were tilted at a sickening angle. Her front door was partially open, creaking in the wind. I climbed the sagging porch and stepped inside. Karen, I shouted, my voice echoing off marble and chaos. Where are you? Up here, she screamed. The staircase to the second floor was cracked down the middle, drywall split like paper. I took the steps 2 at a time, heart pounding with each unstable shift. I found her in the hallway, barefoot, wrapped in a drenched robe, clutching a framed photo of her and her husband like a lifeline. I didn't know, she sobbed. It moved. The whole house moved. We have to go, now. I pulled her arm, but she resisted, still dazed, still not ready to let go of the illusion of control. That was the worst part of people like Karen. Not their cruelty, but their denial. Karen, I said firmly, gripping her shoulders. Listen to me. You do not have a house anymore. What's beneath us is slipping. If we don't leave right now, you'll go with it. Something broke behind her eyes, and she nodded. I dragged her down the staircase as another tremor rippled through the floorboards. The whole house groaned like an animal in its death throes. We barely made it to the street when the western foundation cracked, and then the rest gave in. I watched it happen from across the road. Karen's house folded in on itself, not like an explosion, but like a slow-motion implosion. The central support beam buckled first, and the roof caved inward. Windows popped like gunshots, ejecting glass into the mud. One final rumble, and then silence. The house was gone. We stood there breathing hard, soaked and shivering. Karen dropped the photo, staring at the void where her front lawn used to be. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. Neighbors emerged from their homes pajama-clad and terrified, some with phones, others just stunned. I heard someone call out, "Is everyone okay?" And for the first time in this whole miserable fight, Karen looked at me, not with smugness, not with rage, but with something resembling humility. "You saved my life," she said, voice barely audible. I didn't answer. I just nodded and turned away. Because there wasn't time for catharsis yet. Emergency crews arrived minutes later. Firefighters cordoned off the entire block, ordering evacuations from the remaining ridge homes. Engineers from the city's Department of Structural Safety arrived within the hour. They asked me for the folder. I handed it to them, my affidavit, the photos, the slope diagrams, everything. And they didn't question a thing. They took it seriously now. They had to. At dawn, a city drone team flew over the area and captured thermal and geospatial imaging. The results were damning. The entire eastern section of Highland Ridge Estates had become a slow-moving landslide zone. Karen's collapse wasn't the end. It was the beginning. The drone data revealed slip planes forming beneath 3 additional homes, 2 of which had recently received HOA-approved modifications involving retaining wall removal and deck extensions. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a pattern. And I had warned them. All of them. By noon, City Hall had called an emergency press conference. The mayor herself stood at the podium, flanked by fire chief structural engineers and a representative from the State Geological Survey. She said the words I'd been waiting for. "We have determined that HOA management failed to act on clear and repeated warnings submitted by community residents regarding slope instability. The city will be conducting a full investigation into the role of the HOA board in contributing to this disaster." Karen didn't attend. She was relocated to a temporary shelter that afternoon. The woman who once ruled our neighborhood with condescension and petty fines now slept on a cot under fluorescent lights, surrounded by the very people she used to issue citations to. And I went home. I sat on my porch, and I exhaled. Not out of relief, but because the earth had finally finished speaking. And it had spoken the truth. 2 days after the collapse, our once exclusive zip code became national news. I woke up to find a Channel 8 news van parked at the entrance to the neighborhood. Drones hovered overhead, their soft whirring slicing through the gray sky. One of them carried the emblem of a state geological survey unit, another from a local university, and another red and black with a 6-lens mount was clearly from a national news outlet. We had gone from a suburban HOA enclave to a headline. $1 million homes vanish overnight in landslide. Ignored by HOA. Whistleblower veteran warned neighborhood was threatened. Luxury liability and landslides. What went wrong in Highland Ridge Estates? Reporters came knocking. I turned them away. Politely at first. Then more firmly. I didn't need the spotlight. I needed justice. But justice, it seemed, had finally decided to arrive. By midweek, subpoenas started hitting mailboxes like hail. 3 HOA board members, including Karen, were formally served. The charges weren't criminal yet, but they were serious. Gross negligence, misappropriation of HOA funds, and endangerment due to failure to act on known geological threats. The city's risk management division had filed a civil suit, and private homeowners, 10 of them, joined in a class action claim that would expose every policy, every penny, every shady landscape improvement contract the HOA had issued in the last 3 years. And they wanted me to testify. I agreed, but I didn't do it for revenge. I did it because every late-night insult, every ignored email, every lie printed in those HOA newsletters had led us here to a neighborhood on the brink of literal collapse and a board that had built its empire on topsoil and ego. The hearing took place in the county's municipal building downtown, a beige rectangle of bureaucracy and sour coffee. I wore my army dress blues, not for theatrics, for remembrance, because truth like service demands a uniform of its own. When they called my name, the room hushed. Cameras clicked. I took the stand. Mr. Lambert, in your professional opinion, the city's attorney began, was this disaster preventable? I nodded. Yes. Can you walk us through your warning process? So I did. I showed them the trail cam photos, the fracture lines, the stormwater maps, the communications I sent first cordial, then desperate. I played the voicemail I'd received, the one where a man had warned me to back off. I even produced the HOA newsletter, the one that called me a fearmonger. But it was the drone data that sealed the coffin. The university drone team had overlaid thermal and soil density scans from before and after the collapse. The slope behind Karen's home had shown increasing temperature variance and water saturation for months, evidence of subsurface instability that would have been obvious to any trained eye. The board had that data. I knew it because I had given it to them. And still, they cut the trees, built the patio, mocked the warnings, threatened me with fines. Did anyone on the HOA board respond meaningfully to your reports? The attorney asked. I looked across the room at Karen. She wouldn't meet my eyes. No, I said. They called me dramatic. Were you ever thanked for your efforts? I shook my head, only after the house was gone. When I stepped down, the room stayed silent for 3 full seconds. Then the judge nodded slowly and turned the page in his binder. Karen was called next. She walked to the stand in a tailored black suit, looking smaller than I'd ever seen her. The woman who once barked at landscapers and dictated flower pot dimensions now looked like she'd aged a decade in a week. She tried to pivot, claimed she had relied on contracted professionals, claimed she'd acted in the best interest of aesthetic cohesion and property value, claimed she regretted the miscommunications. But the evidence was overwhelming. The duplicated receipts, the missing permit files, the testimony from contractors who admitted she'd pressured them to bypass drainage protocols. The board's defense team scrambled trying to draw a distinction between negligence and intent, but it didn't matter. In the eyes of the public, the verdict had already been delivered. When we stepped outside after the hearing, the press surged forward. One reporter thrust a microphone toward me. Mr. Lambert, how does it feel to be vindicated? I paused. It doesn't feel like vindication, I said. It feels like confirmation. But you were right, she pressed. The neighborhood owes you everything. I shook my head. They don't owe me anything. But they owe it to themselves to never ignore the truth again. That night back home, I sat on my porch as the last storm clouds finally rolled east. The air smelled clean like wet stone and rebirth. Across the way, Karen's lot was now a raw, cordoned-off cavity yellow tape flapping in the breeze. But there was something else. People were talking again, really talking. Neighbors who once avoided me now came by to ask for help with soil assessments, to review insurance language, to double-check their property lines. Linda had started organizing a new homeowner council, not an HOA, but a coalition of residents with equal voice-rotating leadership and transparency. They even asked if I'd sit in as an advisor. I said yes, not because I wanted to lead, but because if this was going to be rebuilt, someone needed to lay the foundation right this time. 2 weeks after the hearing, I found myself walking into City Hall not as a whistleblower, not as a defendant, not even as a victim, but as a man finally being listened to. The city had called a special public session to address emergency reforms regarding HOA governance and residential safety. The council chamber buzzed with quiet tension. Engineers in sport coats, journalists with click-ready pens, residents from half a dozen subdivisions, all filled the rows under the arching lights and echoing ceiling. And at the front, a long curved bench of city officials ready to finally confront a problem that had simmered too long beneath the surface. They gave me 10 minutes on the floor. I used every second. I began with the facts, how my initial reports were ignored, how the slope failure was predictable, how the HOA had used its authority not to protect residents, but to consolidate power. Then I told the human story. About Marcy's flooded garden. About Linda, who had uncovered doctored records. About the elderly couple on Lot 53, who had to be rescued by fire personnel when their driveway gave way at midnight. And finally about Karen. Not with venom, just truth. She didn't act out of malice, I said, scanning the room. She acted out of pride. And pride is dangerous when it's written into policy. The chamber was silent. The council voted unanimously to open a formal citywide audit of all HOA structures and bylaws within their jurisdiction. They also proposed a new ordinance that would require third-party geotechnical review and municipal approval for any land-altering construction near designated hazard zones, regardless of HOA permissions. It passed in under 30 minutes. Later that day, Monica from the city's engineering office found me outside by the fountain. "You did it," she said, smiling for the first time in weeks. "No," I replied, "we did it." But not everyone shared that sentiment. I'd barely gotten home before I got a knock at the door. It was a young man in a suit, early 30s, nervous, holding a leather folder. He introduced himself as a junior clerk for a civil attorney. "I'm here on behalf of the Highland Ridge Estates Homeowners Association." I raised an eyebrow. "They still exist." He blinked. "Well, technically. But I'm here to deliver this." He handed me the folder. Inside was a document formally notarized, confirming the dissolution of the existing HOA board, effective immediately. Karen had resigned. Trish and Alan followed. The liability claims were still pending, but the board had voted to temporarily transfer operational control of the neighborhood to a city-appointed transitional committee. And then there was the letter, typed, dated, and unsigned, but the language was unmistakably hers. "Ray, perhaps we both saw the worst in each other. Perhaps we both wanted control. You wanted safety. I wanted order. I hope you got what you wanted. K." I folded the paper and slid it back into the folder. No response was needed, because I had gotten what I wanted. Not victory, not recognition, but safety, and the right to speak the truth without being labeled a threat. The very next morning, I stood at the edge of the ridge with a team of state geological surveyors. The city had commissioned a full topographic reanalysis of Highland Ridge Estates. We walked the still damp trail behind what was once Karen's property, now just raw ground and plastic orange fencing. "You were right," one of them said, crouching near a dip in the trail. "This whole zone was on a hair trigger." I didn't smile. I just nodded and pointed toward a patch of land farther west. That's Section 2. There's subsurface shearing from old irrigation lines. You'll see the shift in the satellite scans. He scribbled notes. "We should bring you in as a consultant." I almost laughed. I was just a retired Army engineer with a clipboard and some stubborn ethics. But sometimes that's exactly what a neighborhood needs. Back home, Linda had already begun organizing a new resident committee. Nothing legally binding, just a coalition of neighbors who talked. No titles, no power plays. Just people with a shared interest in staying informed and keeping each other safe. She asked if I would sit on the advisory group just until they got their legs. I agreed. And as we held our first informal meeting on her back porch, Half a dozen chairs, a pot of coffee, a whiteboard with notes on proper water runoff systems. I felt something I hadn't in a long time. Community. Not forced compliance. Not fear of fines. Just people helping each other understand their land, their rights, and their responsibilities. One man, James, who had once looked away when I passed on the street, now shook my hand firmly. "I didn't believe you," he said. "But you were right. And we're lucky you didn't stop." I didn't say anything. Just clapped him on the back. Because this wasn't about being right. It was about not letting people get buried, by mud, by silence, or by power. The next week, a new sign went up at the top of the Ridge Trail. "Enter at own risk. Geotechnical review in progress." Below it, someone had added a handwritten line in black marker. "Thanks, Ray." I stood there for a moment, letting the wind wash over me, watching the sun crest over the remaining houses. And for the first time since this all began, I felt the earth still. Just for a moment. Still. A month after the last hearing, I got a letter in the mail this time. Not from a lawyer, not from the city, not even from the HOA, which technically no longer existed. It was from Marcy. Inside a plain envelope was a simple card with embossed flowers. No glitter, no grand flourish. Just one handwritten sentence. "You saved more than just our homes. You reminded us what it means to live in a neighborhood." I set the card on my mantle next to the trail cam I'd taken down its batteries, long dead now. The photos it had taken, the silent sequence of a hillside surrendering to pressure, had been copied into city archives, legal reports, and news features. But the original SD card, that stayed with me. Because while the fight was over, the memory mattered. Highland Ridge Estates changed after the collapse. Some people left the pain too fresh, the cracks in their walls. Not just physical. Others stayed dug in, resolved to rebuild not just houses, but relationships. Karen disappeared. Her home was never rebuilt. The lot was fenced off permanently after state surveyors ruled the underlying slope permanently compromised. Rumor had it she moved back east to live with family. I never heard from her again. And honestly, I didn't need to. Not because I hated her, but because some lessons don't need a reunion, they just need consequences. City contractors came in by January, reinforcing the hillside with geogrid retaining systems and terraced drainage buffers. For the first time since I'd moved here, engineers walked the ridge with clipboards that weren't trying to silence me. Linda's grassroots committee grew. What began as a dozen voices became a community-wide forum. They installed weather sensors, real-time runoff meters, and even invited a local university to run environmental studies with student interns. The HOA newsletters, gone. Replaced by handwritten bulletin boards and a monthly potluck schedule. Instead of citations, people were swapping pie recipes. Instead of fines, they were showing up at each other's doorsteps with extra sandbags and buckets of gravel. And me, I kept mostly quiet. I still fixed my own fence, cleaned my own gutters, patched my own siding. But when people knocked, and they still did, I always answered. "Hey Ray, can you take a look at this crack on our patio?" "Ray, we're thinking of putting in a rain garden. Should we dig that far back?" "Ray, can you come by the school next week and talk to the kids about land safety?" I'd chuckle, but I'd go. Not because I liked attention, but because I remembered how it felt when I was the only one seeing the danger, the only one speaking up into silence. There's a kind of loneliness in being right too soon. But there's peace in helping others get it right the next time. One evening in March, after a stretch of blessedly dry weather, I hiked up the ridge alone. The city had installed a public safety barrier, but the trail beyond it was walkable. I reached the summit just before dusk and looked down at the neighborhood below, no longer perfect, but finally real. I thought of my wife, how she used to say that the best homes aren't the ones that shine the brightest, but the ones that survive the storm. She would have liked it here now. As I stood there, hands on my hips, I felt a vibration in my coat pocket. A message from Monica. And we're officially adding Highland Ridge Estates to the list of monitored geological zones. Your initial reports being used to draft new citywide HOA accountability standards. Thought you should know. I smiled. No news crew would report it. No headline would scream it across the screen. But this was the victory. Not just in court. Not just in land use law. But in the quiet, stubborn persistence of people refusing to be buried. I stayed up on that ridge until the sun dipped behind the hills. The sky turned a bruised purple. The wind shifted low and warm. No rumble. No groan. just stillness. And this time, it didn't feel like silence before disaster. It felt like the world holding its breath and letting go. So did I. I turned, walked back down toward the homes that stood not because they were perfect, but because finally we had listened, and the ground at last was willing to forgive us.